If you don't like it, scroll on by. That's something that most of us have said or seen over the last couple of years. It's fairly common and it's easy. It avoids conflict and no one needs to be sent to Facebook jail or have their YouTube account wiped out. So why is it then that private companies feel that they should play God over what is right and what is not right, and what is news and what is fake news online? So today, I am taking a closer look at the difference between government and private companies like Facebook and Twitter when it comes to freedom of speech, and why your right to not be offended should never trump my right to express my lawful opinion. So let's just dive right in. Welcome back to Renegade News. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski. Every week on this channel, we discuss how entrepreneurs and other freedom lovers just like you can build cancel culture-proof businesses, create a bigger impact in their business in the world, and completely break free from the system.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to apologize.
Why did you say ladies first? That's sexist.
It's just a standard greeting. Let me start over. Gentlemen and ladies.
Ooh, says the man.
Okay, sorry. Humans in the audience.
I identify as a basketball.
Humans and basketballs.
I'm a parrot who mimics words but doesn't comprehend them.
Humans, basketballs, talking parrots, and whatever else is out there.
Whatever? It's whoever. Actually, it's whomever. No one likes you, Mary.
All right, just calm down, okay?
Now you're tone policing us.
That makes me uncomfortable. Anything that makes me uncomfortable in 2017 should be illegal.
You know what?
Gotta love Brian. In the days following the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, several major social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook made the controversial decision to indefinitely suspend the account of former President Donald Trump. Now, I don't care if you like Donald Trump or not, that's totally irrelevant. But even before this happened, there had been this increasing concern among many Americans, especially on the conservative side or the right side of the aisle, libertarians, those type of people, over the suppression of certain ideas by big tech. So in response to the widespread reports of misinformation and fake news, many of these social media platforms have faced calls to take down this false information, calls from social justice warriors, calls from the government, which at that time was considered a conspiracy theory. We now know that that's been proven true. And just others concerned asking these social media platforms to take down this information. But regardless of how noble this attempt to stop the spread of misinformation might seem on the outside, these measures of censorship do set a dangerous precedent for the future of democracy in the United States and in the rest of the world, in the prospects of freedom in all these different places. Because over the past 3 years, many social media platforms have taken actions against false or misleading information, or what they call false or misleading information. They've removed posts, they've suspended accounts, they've created notices, and they've otherwise discouraged certain types of speech, mostly speech that didn't fit their woke agendas. A good example is the Kyle Rittenhouse case. And in that case, it garnered national attention, and many Americans wanted to voice their support for him. Now, at that time, Rittenhouse hadn't been acquitted yet, and like any criminal defendant, he should have had the right to be deemed innocent until proven guilty. In the end, he was proven innocent anyway. But even before that happened, he still had that right to be innocent until proven guilty. But Facebook and these other platforms had designated any support of him as supporting a mass murderer, essentially, and they decided to start taking those types of posts down. Now, the basis of all American society lies in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and their protection of freedom of speech. Other countries have different levels of freedom of speech. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But without those freedom of speech, all the other liberties and of democracy, all the other freedoms and rights that we have are, in my opinion, completely worthless. So if a country doesn't have freedom of speech, that means they don't have freedom. Canada, I'm looking at you. It's so fundamental, and that freedom of speech is predicated on, and it should be predicated on, the marketplace of ideas. In a free market, goods and services that perform the best at the lowest price prevail, while the worst products fail. That's the whole concept behind freedom of speech. Well, in the marketplace of ideas, it's the same thing. The true and the best ideas are going to emerge from those public discussions, and all the erroneous or otherwise detrimental ideas, they're going to be rejected and they're going to get pushed down in the stack naturally. If we have that freedom to converse and have those freedom discussions, the best ideas are going to float to the top. That's just what's going to happen. Now, back in 1801, in his first inaugural address, President Thomas Jefferson echoed that belief. He says that an error of opinion may be tolerated where the reason is left free to combat it. And that's what freedom of speech means. There's going to be bad ideas. There will always be bad ideas, but let the best ideas push those out. And that's really the basis of all protection of freedom of speech. And obviously there's certain crimes such as incitement of violence that still are not considered freedom of speech. You can't incite violence. That's different than having a freedom of speech. It's pretty obvious, in my opinion, where these lines are. And these are really clear. I mean, if you're not inciting violence, then you're not inciting violence. Pretty simple as that. And even if an opinion is considered wrong or socially disastrous or socially bad, it's the place of public debate to determine that rather than the place of the government, because the government's going to be biased towards their own ideology. And clearly, they're not right. Most of the time, all the time, some of the time, depending on how you look at it. So one example was a classic case of the Supreme Court ruling in the Texas versus Johnson case back in 1989. The court held that Texas law prohibiting the desecration of the American flag was unconstitutional because burning the flag was expressive conduct protected by the First Amendment. So prohibiting the flag desecration is no better than the forced patriotism of an authoritarian state. So by saying that you can't burn the flag, you're essentially saying you have to worship your government, you cannot go against your state, which is fundamentally against the policies of a free country. If we can't do that, we're slipping into a dictatorship. So whether it's societally accepted or not, the law cannot infringe on an individual citizen's free expression. And in the marketplace of ideas, all opinions have to be heard. Now, cancel culture and censorship really got new wind from around 2020, 2019, mostly in 2020 though, and we started to hear terminology like fact checkers, misinformation, disinformation, all these terms suddenly became known, and there was this global tsunami of censorship of anyone who had a different opinion than whatever the main narrative was. That main narrative coming from big tech, coming from the big five tech platforms, coming from mainstream media, coming from the government, or the current government who is in power. Now, however, we know that history's proven that the opinions and beliefs that are supported by only a small minority are often the ones that are right. So even if most of the society believed the narrative that was being passed in 2020 and since 2020, which I don't think in a lot of cases is true, but again, that's a whole other discussion. But even if those are true, it's the small minority opinions that are often right. And those beliefs that are held by the large majority, or especially by the government, they're often quite wrong. And this isn't new. There's nothing new here. Back in the 17th century, the Catholic Church strictly cracked down on heliocentrism, which was the idea that planets orbited around the sun. And now the general consensus is that that is true, and the belief of geocentrism, which is the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe, is generally accepted to be false. Now, I know there's a flat Earth movement. We're not getting into that. There are people who don't necessarily believe that, and they should have their ability to present their opinions and their evidence to that fact. But anyway, majority of us have accepted that the world revolves around the sun. Back in those days, back in the 1700s, most people believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and that everything rotated around the Earth. Well, Galileo, and he's now considered the father of modern science, he was charged by the church for vehement suspicion of heresy because he promoted this heliocentrism, that the Earth actually rotated around the sun. And he was placed under house arrest until he was dead. So restrictions on freedom of speech can also have far more worse consequences than just simply lifting or limiting some scientific theory, although that's a big one. But look at what happened in modern-day China. The government censorship of free speech has completely demolished any concept of freedom and democracy there. Any public opposition to China's ruling party can result in time in actual prison and jail just for disagreeing with that official narrative. And with the Chinese government serving as the ultimate arbiter of truth, historical facts, and foreign influences and cultural practices, all of these other ideas have been suppressed or distorted in order to uphold its authoritarian regime. And the obstruction of freedom of speech is this tool for tyrannies to erase dissent, indoctrinate citizens, and annihilate liberty. Thus, freedom of speech is both an ideological and a practical basis for American society, and generally society in the West, the American being the the strong example of where freedom of speech really should have come from. However, that First Amendment's protection against limiting freedom of speech only applies to the federal government. And the Supreme Court has also interpreted it as the applying to state governments as well. So therefore, it might seem that private corporations like Facebook have the right to enforce speech on their platforms, and they probably should. But the government is not the sole entity that threatens the marketplace of ideas, especially in this age of social media, where a handful of private companies also govern these forums for public discourse. And those few platforms can dictate who may speak and what they may say. In a speech to Congress about corporate power, President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerated the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism, ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or any controlling private power." As Roosevelt declared, the tyranny of private companies is no better than the tyranny of a government. And if free speech is so sacrosanct, so important, that it cannot be curtailed by a democratically elected government of the United States, then there is no rationale as to why a small number of massive corporations can do it now. Simply because these social media platforms are not part of the government does not lessen the danger that they present. And Americans cannot truly enjoy any measure of freedom of speech while any individual or group can restrict it. And that's true all over the world. And that's especially true since the government is controlling or dictating what a lot of these platforms are allowing you to say. Again, used to be a conspiracy theory. Thanks to the Twitter fires, we know that's not true. But even ignoring that for just a minute, just having your freedom of speech limited by social media platforms on their own is problematic, because right now there are two alternatives. And theoretically, censorship of an individual social media platform should not be a significant issue, because they could be substituted by a multitude of other viable alternatives, similar to a restaurant or a grocery store. But in reality today, because of the cost of entry, the cost of getting into that market, and the roadblocks placed, given that only a few select companies have basically a monopoly over social media, there are very few feasible replacements for it. We have fortunately talked about a few of those feasible replacements in other videos, and we'll add a link to those videos at the end. But they are very limited, and most people don't know about them because the way we get words out today is via social media. So just like barring immigration, citizens cannot choose a different government. And that's what's happening here today. Consumers are largely unable to choose different social media platforms. So some examples, like Trump's bans from Facebook and Twitter basically deplatformed him completely from mainstream social media. And that basically eliminated his ability to participate in the marketplace of ideas. Hate and misinformation are certainly byproducts of freedom of speech. And that's a problem. Nobody wants hate speech. Nobody wants this misinformation. But that doesn't matter, because free speech, even speech that is considered prejudicial or untrue, is necessary in order to maintain that healthy dialogue and that healthy democracy that comes from that. In their comprehensive analysis of Trump's ban, Twitter explained that Trump had violated its policy against the glorification of violence. That was the excuse they used. Specifically, Twitter cited 2 of his tweets in which he thanked his supporters and stated that he was not going to attend the inauguration of Joe Biden. There wasn't a single word in either of those tweets that referenced any sort of violence at all. Nobody can show that because they didn't exist. But Twitter stated that these 2 tweets must be read in the context of the January 6th riots. But in these 2 tweets, he does not even allude to the claim that the election being fraudulent, much less applaud or glorify any violence. It was Twitter's own subjective assessment of those tweets that led to his suspension from the platform. On the other hand, while Twitter has permanently banned Trump for his role of glorifying behavior in tweets that didn't exist, Twitter has ignored numerous breaches of its policies, including the glorification of violence and hateful conduct by the Twitter accounts of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei of Iran, who was a brutal dictator with a long record of human rights violations. And those inconsistencies in enforcing their policy demonstrates the really critical danger of social media censorship. It wouldn't be as bad as it could be if it was applied and could be applied evenly, but it can't be. So that means what's happening is you're getting this echo chamber of one opinion, and that's the only opinion that you're able to see. And the First Amendment rights of Americans should not be subject to the arbitrary whims of some big social media companies or for that matter, virtual signaling snowflakes who believe that their right to be offended trumps your right to free speech, which is protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution and protected by different bills in different countries. Now, freedom of speech may be guaranteed in the Constitution of the US, but that isn't the case everywhere. Freedom of speech doesn't exist at all in China. And in Canada, the little that still exists is in the process of being taken away now that Trudeau has a couple of different censorship bills that are in process. And that's really not surprising. After all, Trudeau is a fan of China's dictatorship. But if we ever want to solve the world's problems and not slip into a totalitarian hellhole, we need to fight for our freedom of speech in every way possible. And that's why it's our mission at Renegade News and my personal mission to help experts, influencers, and other entrepreneurs and business owners make sure that their businesses are bulletproof against these threats. So become cancel-proof by subscribing to Renegade News right now. And check out the video that you see on the screen to see 10 applications that are freedom of speech friendly, and they are alternatives to the sanctimonious BS of big tech. I'm Glenn Kowalski from Renegade News, and I'll see you over there.